Welcome. This is Vivica Williams with UATV Head to Head. We're speaking today with Vitaly Golomb. He was born in Odesa. He's a venture capitalist, entrepreneur, author, and keynote speaker. Today, we're talking about the startup culture, innovation, and business in general in Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So, yes, as I said, you were born in Ukraine, but you live in the States. You do a lot of traveling back and forth. So, what have you noticed about the startup and entrepreneur culture in Ukraine in the last few decades?
It's pretty nascent. So the technology world is pretty developed as far as software being one of the top export industries in Ukraine for a long time. But the startup world is a little bit different. It's developing products, not just writing software for foreign companies doing that. And that's pretty early. I've been involved with that world, that part of the world in Ukraine for the last 3 or 4 years. First as a board member of an accelerator, putting on a number of events, speaking at a number of events. And it's growing, it's good. The brains are here, but we need the sales and marketing experience to catch up.
And so Ukraine's educated population, as you're saying, the brains are here. This has been called one of Ukraine's greatest strengths. But this can't be all that can draw people to Ukraine. What else are you seeing here that maybe could be a big draw?
So Ukraine is, by many measures, number 4 in the world in software development after China, India, and US. So that's great, but that's not enough on its own. The innovation clusters are much more than just engineers. It's entrepreneurs. So these are people that are inspired to solve problems, locally or globally, using technology. It's venture capitalists that are investing serious amounts of money and raising funds around that. It's universities pumping out more engineers, more entrepreneurs. That's somewhat pretty good here. It's a number of professionals that surround that, so lawyers and accountants that know technology and how to structure these types of deals. It's government, which is an important area that's missing in Ukraine right now because of the priorities. And the government's supposed to create the economic conditions to inspire and motivate foreign capital to come into the country and make investments. And then ultimately large companies are also investing in companies. I'm part of HP, a little startup out of Silicon Valley, the world's first, and investing in companies and then also being their source of M&A, so buying the companies when they graduate. So most companies won't go public, they'll get bought by large companies. All these things have to exist for the innovation cluster to work and be fully functional. And there are other parts of the world, like Israel, you can see that in the period of about 20 years, went from 0 to hero and is only second to Silicon Valley now.
Wow. So, and you were talking about specifically with the government and the business environment and this being an issue. And Ukraine, I think it's mostly small and medium enterprises. This be 80% or something like this was the rate. So how are you seeing the business environment change? It seems like it's not changing fast enough, is what you're saying, or?
It's never fast enough. Oh. People will complain in Silicon Valley, in London, and New York that things are not moving as fast as they'd like. The revolution happened and everybody thought that tomorrow, the next day, everything's going to change. It takes a generation for these things to change, and it takes a long time for an innovation cluster to build. Silicon Valley is, the way it is now, the reason it exists is about, it's 70-year history. And the first 20, 30 years were very slow going with the government, U.S. government, Department of Defense being the first customer, and then starting to put in matching funds and motivating East Coast investors to come in and start investing heavily into technology. And then there was a first wave of integrated circuits. That went on for about 10, 15, 20 years. And only after that was Apple, Microsoft, et cetera, was born in the 70s, mid-70s. So it takes a while and it takes patience. But the government needs to realize that it can't be something that's put off because it takes time to cook. And yes, there are other priorities, defense and supporting big existing industries, but without investment in innovation, it'll never come, right? And the world is changing. Technology, new technology, new wave of technology is starting to eat a lot of the old industries, right? So transportation, logistics, manufacturing, in the next 10 years, it's going to be flipped upside down. So all those things need to be invested in, and knowing that it's not going to happen. The results are not coming tomorrow; they're coming in 5 years and 10 years.
And I see here in Ukraine now there are a lot of cities trying to become startup cities, industrial hubs. Dnipro was just changed into this. Slavuch, I think near Chernobyl, is trying to push for this. Kharkiv. So a lot of cities in Ukraine. What do you see about about this. I think there's more where they're getting the support from. Is this a better way to pursue becoming more startup than trying to go through the state government?
What I think you're seeing is a number of talented and motivated and passionate individuals that are going to their home city and they're trying to make something happen. And the raw material they're using is coming from the outsourcing industry and the kind of an abundance of software engineering. So all those things are positive. But there's one little catch. The catch is that you can't rely on software development being the base for much, much longer, because the next wave is coming. And the next wave is artificial intelligence, virtual reality, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, more hardcore science. So on the one hand, the software industry and the outsourcing industry is a good kind of starting point, but you can't stop there.
Right.
On the other hand, Ukraine has a huge advantage because just like it has a good amount of software developers, it also has electrical engineers, chemists, physicists, mechanics, etc. These are the engineers of kind of the next wave that's coming in the next decade.
Right. And so you've been here for a couple of days. You've come back several times. You said last time was about 6 months ago. So can you tell me if you've seen any specific companies or startups that have developed that really catch your eye, that can maybe encompass these things you're talking about?
Yeah, so there's an ongoing struggle between again, kind of outsourcing companies where it's a service business and they're selling services on an hourly basis. And kind of a derogatory economic term for it is kind of the technological slave class, right? From the economic sense. And then the product companies actually get to generate the value and keep the value. There are a couple of companies that have been around for a number of years. Riedel in Odesa, in my hometown, that's been dominating the iOS App Store as far as business productivity apps since the beginning of the App Store. Never took any investment, 140 people or so, doing great. Great growing business, and kind of what they're doing now is outsourcing their sales and marketing to the U.S. to enterprises.
This opposite type.
Exactly. There's another one, MacPaw, which is in Kiev. I got to visit their office yesterday. Very cool office, great setup, and they've been doing applications for Mac for a long time. And for a long time, I think people didn't even realize it's a Ukrainian company. Also self-funded, and now the founder, who's very young, just turning 30 this week. I heard he's investing in the next generation of startups. And then a couple of positive examples of companies that came out of Ukraine and then went global via Silicon Valley. PetCube,
yes,
hardware company with a camera for pets and a whole software behind it. Right. So now they have about 35 engineers in Ukraine and about 6 or 7 people in San Francisco. So that seems to be a great model. And then right behind is a company called Sixa, who are doing virtualizing computers in the cloud. And they also came out of Ukraine, small team, and went through Y Combinator, which is the world's top accelerator, just like PetCube. So you're seeing a lot of these brains actually now going to where the opportunity is, where they get enough of the attention, enough of the capital and support, and they're able to straddle both sides, where they have engineering, where it's much easier to build a great engineering team and much more cost effective, and they are closer to their customers and investors in Silicon Valley in those two cases.
All right. And now you just talked about brains going to where they can, leaving Ukraine in a sense. So I'm interested in if you have some ideas how Ukraine can stop a brain drain, especially if we look at with the EU doing visa liberalization for Ukraine. What do you think about that? How to stop a brain drain from Ukraine?
So I like to look at these things from two perspectives, and you know, there's anecdotal thinking where you think, okay, well, this happened to me, that means I'm looking at the world through this lens, and it's a little bit closed-minded, and it gives us things like Brexit and Trump. And then there's statistical thinking where you're looking at kind of the big picture and what's happening. So yes, it's inevitable that there are a lot of people that want to, you know, they want to go to where opportunity is for themselves, but reality is that you have to work on the environment overall to kind of reverse the trend and give opportunities to world-class talented people in Ukraine so they can pursue their dreams here and get self-actualized here, right? Without being forced to basically say, okay, well, if I want to be the best in the world, I have to move.
Right.
That's kind of the mentality right now, but hopefully. Again, this goes back to government support, is that they support innovation in a big way. They create the environment for people to be able to stay where they need to stay, where they are, where they're born, and keep the value inside the country.
Absolutely.
I mean, ultimately, we live in a global world, so it's going to be a matter of kind of do you build an engineering team in Ukraine because Ukraine is very good and specializes in this, and then you have sales and marketing elsewhere, or kind of how do you make this combination? So it really shouldn't be kind of the whole company leaving, but it should be kind of a global perspective.
Right. And so what advice then do you have maybe for those, we're looking at our international watchers, who are maybe interested but hesitant in investing in Ukraine or starting businesses here?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a fear, what they see on the news, on CNN, BBC, et cetera, about what's happening with the conflict. That's certainly a concern, but they need to realize that that's a very small part of the country, and it's not really a part of the country that was ever, technologically advanced. So if they're looking at Ukraine to do kind of old industry, perhaps that should give them pause, but I don't think so. But if they're looking especially at high tech, they need to understand that the centers are elsewhere, and what is here in abundance is this raw material of very smart, very well educated, some of the smartest people in the world in technologies that are well placed in the future.
All right, great. And my last question is, what advice would you give to Ukrainians who are looking to start up? And I know we're looking at your most recent book, Accelerated Startup. So I know there's probably a lot of advice, and you can give us some takeaways from that and advice that you would give.
Sure. So the idea is that, well, I'll give you kind of an anecdote, right? It's that on any given day, there are a number of delegations from any country in the world coming to Silicon Valley, landing at San Francisco airport, and going and thinking that, we're the smartest kids in our little town, and they come to the Startup Olympics, where it's the best of the best in the world. They'll go do a demo day, and they think they'll meet investors and get investment. Reality, that shouldn't be the objective of the trip. The objective is to come over for a couple of weeks, here and there, maybe a couple of times a year, and learn. Learn how things, what they're supposed to look like when they're going full speed, get a little bit calibrated on what the environment should look like, understand the standards, learn. Then go back, develop the companies, and try to get to that world-class level. And at some point, they should be global in most things, unless they're choosing to be, a regional leader. So there are plenty of opportunities, for example, in e-commerce. That's very much a regional play, versus hardcore technology that's going to be the basis for companies of the third industrial revolution, which are also highly, highly interesting to me. Wow. So yeah, I mean, number one advice authors like to give is read my book, right?
Well, I'm looking forward to reading this actually, because I think this could be some great advice as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And we've been joined today by Vitaly Golomb. He is a venture capitalist and author who is from Odesa but now lives in the U.S. Today we've talked about startup culture, innovation, and the future of business in Ukraine. Thank you very much. This is UATV.